Hi everyone, and welcome to what I hope will become a long series on mixing with Mercs. So one of the biggest things that I love about food is that food brings up memories and stories to almost all of us. And the story that we're telling today is of a cookbook called Island Born and Bred. And this is a collection of recipes put together by the United Methodist Women of Harker's Island United Methodist Church. And this cookbook has sold out multiple times and put the children of these women through college. This particular cookbook has a huge number of recipes that families in Harker's Island and now the children of those families are following for generations. Harker's Island is quite possibly the most beautiful place on earth. The views that they have are absolutely stunning. The sunsets are the most beautiful in the world, and it also has the view of what I think is the prettiest lighthouse, which is Cape Lookout Lighthouse. The history of that area is incredible, and the families that live there span back for generations. And that's part of what I love about the connection to this particular recipe. So my connection to this recipe is through my dear friend Susie Lewis. And Susie is a longtime resident of Harker's Island, and so she shared with me the recipe for old-fashioned light rolls that they've made in their family for years and years. And you can see their notations for some changes they made in the recipe. But what they have noticed is that when they make the recipe in Harker's Island that it works, but when they make the recipe here in the middle part of the state that it does not work as well. But their history with this cookbook is absolutely incredible because Susie got a copy of this cookbook from both her mother and her grandmother, but they both inscribed in the front cover, so she was able to pass on the copy from her mother to her son, and both of them have copies of this cookbook from their grandmothers, which I think is an incredible legacy to lead on. So when I am making this recipe, I'm following the original version, and I have a couple of reasons that I'm following the original version that I'll talk about throughout. But part of the reason that Susie wanted me to do this was that she wanted to see if part of the reason that it was not working as well was geography. And I think that we have figured out the reason that it wasn't working as well, and we're going to talk through that process. I think one of the biggest tragedies that we have with passing on traditions and passing on the recipes and things that we have is that people are not spending time with previous generations to learn how to cook the things that they know. And I've heard people say a million times, well, my grandmother doesn't measure, so I don't know how to cook things. Well, your grandmother does measure. She just has a way of measuring that we might not understand. And so part of what I'm hoping to do with this series is maybe take some of the recipes that your family might have lost and be able to recreate them or fix them. So hopefully we can do that with this recipe here today. Please stay tuned at the end of this video because I am going to include at the end of the video the inscription that's at the beginning of the cookbook that talks about their reason for making the cookbook. So to begin with, all the recipe says about the temperature of the water is that it needs to be warm. And knowing what we know about the science of yeast, because this is a yeast bread recipe, we understand now that yeast is going to not activate at temperatures below about 110, but at temperatures of above about 125 degrees, the yeast is actually going to die. Those temperatures are too high for the yeast to survive. So what we're looking for when we are measuring the temperature of this water is that we want it to be between about 110 degrees and 125 degrees. So the next thing we're going to do is, according to the recipe, the next step is to add your yeast to the warm water. But we're going to vary a little bit from where the recipe adds your next step. The sugar is added in with the dry ingredients in the recipe. We're going to add it in with the yeast. And our reason for doing this is that we're going to do this to let the yeast get a little bit of a jump start. This gives the yeast something to feed off of right to begin with, and gives us the greatest chance that the bread is going to rise. So by adding the sugar at this stage, the yeast has something to feed off of, which is going to mean that once it gets into the flour, it's not going to have to fight the flour for the water as it's going ahead, as it's trying to feed. So this is going to just kind of give us a little insurance policy as we go along. Any yeast spread that I make, I always add the sugar in this step just to allow us the biggest possible chance of success when it comes to the rise later on in this step. We're also going to give it a little stir just to make sure everything's completely dissolved. So now comes our chance to eliminate some variables. So I am trying this with 3 different brands of flour. We're going to do Gold Medal, King Arthur, and White Lily. And this is just to test out and see how each of these different flours react. Now, my original thoughts were we weren't going to have a huge difference with these. I had a feeling the White Lily was not going to work quite as well just because that is a lower gluten flour. But I just wanted to check and see if this was going to have a huge difference on your final product. The original recipe stated that you needed to use Gold Medal flour specifically. And just based on what I've known from past performance, the brand of flour doesn't usually make a huge difference, but if it does, Gold Medal is not usually the brand that I would choose. So we're going to put 6 cups of each type of flour into our bowls. So then you're going to add your salt into each of your flours, and then you're going to use a whisk and stir that in completely. And part of the reason that we're adding the salt into the dry ingredients is that salt does 2 things. First of all, it's going to check the growth of the yeast, because salt will actually kill yeast if it's exposed to it in greater amounts. And so it also is going to make sure that the yeast doesn't grow too much and then collapse in the bread. But by mixing it into the dry ingredients, we're kind of protecting the yeast from it a little bit. So we're just mixing that up to make sure it's fully incorporated. So then you're going to add your shortening in. And I love these plunger measuring cups for measuring any sort of shortening or peanut butter or anything that's thick like that, just because it's a lot easier to get it out of the cups. And we're adding 4 tablespoons of shortening in here. And the way that shortening functions in any recipe is it's going to inhibit gluten formation, and so that's the reason these rolls are going to remain soft over time. When you eat something like a baguette doesn't have any fat in it whatsoever, which is the reason that they're tough and chewy. These rolls end up being very, very soft, and part of the reason for that is the shortening in the recipe. You're going to work the shortening into the flour with your fingers. You could also use a pastry cutter for this step, but this is just like working the flour in for biscuits. And this process is known as cutting in, if you ever are looking for the technical cooking term for it. But as you're working this in, you just want to get the shortening pieces as small as possible, and you're looking for this to be kind of like cornmeal by the time that you finish with this process. And it's going to take some time, so just take your time with the process, don't rush it, and make sure that this is fully worked in. So now we're going to begin our process of mixing. So add your water, yeast, and sugar mixture into your dry ingredient mixture, and make sure that you get every bit of yeast out of the bowl. And you're going to mix this up with your hands. And I am working it with my hands in the bowl until I get it as combined as I possibly can, and getting up as much of that flour as I can. And what you will start to notice is the more you mix it, it's going to really, really gum up on your hands to start with, but the more that you mix it and the more that the water combines with the flour, the more it will start to pull away from your hands, and that means that you're doing well with this mixing process. And then once you get it mostly combined to where there's not really any water really left in there, you're going to get as much of that dough off of your hands as possible and get it onto your board or your countertop. And then you're going to start the process of kneading that together. And it's going to be kind of a crumbly mash to begin with, but it will start to become more and more smooth and elastic as you work it and as the water combines into the flour a little bit more. And just keep on pulling that flour in there as you are continuing to work. You shouldn't need to add any extra flour to the board unless it really starts sticking. You want to use as little flour as possible because the more flour you add, the drier your final product will be. And you know you'll be ready to stop when the top of it just kind of looks smooth and is not as uneven. So as you can see, we've worked this until the top of it is smooth and elastic and the surface of it is pretty even. So once you get to this point, you're going to set that aside to rise. So after doing the first one with the gold medal flour, I next worked with the King Arthur flour. And I'm going to be honest with you, in the past I haven't really been a big subscriber to there being a huge difference in flour, but right away I noticed that this flour felt a lot smoother, it worked a lot easier, it just felt like a higher quality flour, and it definitely just seemed from the very beginning to be working a good bit better. And part of the reason for that is when you're working with flours, and especially with yeast breads, gluten formation is really important. And when you're working with gluten, those flours are going to seem like they slip between your fingers a little bit more just because of the protein content. And this flour was definitely doing this, but it also seemed as if the grind of it was just a little bit cleaner and the flour just seemed to be a better quality grind as well. And as I was kneading the dough and pulling it together, it seemed to come into a smoother dough a lot more quickly than the other flour did with the gold medal. But the interesting part about reading the recipe is that the original recipe called for gold medal flour specifically, which was really interesting. Looking at this dough, you can literally tell that the dough just is more smooth and elastic from the very start of the kneading process. And the way that you will see that evidenced is that the top of it just doesn't have that rough and jagged finish. And you don't want to knead this a whole lot because you want your dough to be soft and your rolls to be soft in the end product. So after this, we started working with the white lily flour. And to be entirely honest with you, this is the first time I purchased this, and to also be honest with you, this will also be the last time I purchase white lily flour. And the label of the flour says that it's a low gluten flour, which we know that this is not going to work well for a yeast bread to begin with, but also for a biscuit, it's not going to hold up extremely well either. And as you can see from this kneading process, it is gummy and sticky and gooey to begin with. It is just not coming together as well. I ended up having to add extra flour. It was a pain to work with. And on the label, it says that for this flour that you need to add extra from the beginning. So it says to add, for each cup, to add an extra little bit to the recipe. But since this is made from a winter wheat and a low gluten flour, it's just not going to work very well for anything that you want to hold together. Another thing that a lot of people don't realize about flour is that the gluten content is determined quite often by where it grows. So the flour that grows in the South actually has less gluten in it, which is possibly / probably the reason why biscuits are a lot more popular in the South than yeast breads are, because the flour that we grew just wasn't capable of holding enough structure for yeast to be able to work well in it. And I was never really able to get this to get that smooth elastic finish that I was looking for, and it just kept on picking up more and more flour, and I would have to add extra flour into the board. So our next step is going to be to allow this dough to rise. And this is not really a time thing, and this is going to depend entirely on the conditions of your kitchen and what you have going on in terms of humidity. So this does not have a time limit because you are letting it rise until it's doubled in size. And this is one of the areas that we were having issues with in the original recipe, that it was rising in Harker's Island and it was not rising when they were making it in the middle part of the state. And so this was what we were trying to figure out, is if this was a geography type situation. Now, humidity affects things, temperature check affects things, because yeast needs a very specific set of conditions in order to grow. And the yeast is just sitting there chilling in the dough, and it is eating the sugar that's in there, and it is either burping or it is farting, depending on which one makes you giggle more or laugh more. And as it's sitting there, it is expelling carbon dioxide and alcohol, which is what gives it that yeasty smell that we're used to smelling, that makes your kitchen smell amazing and makes things smell good when it bakes as well. And you also want to cover those with a towel so that a crust doesn't form and the dough has freedom to rise throughout this process. So as I mentioned, we're not looking for a time limit here, but we're looking to have this double in size, and this is where this broke my brain, because I was really not expecting a huge difference in the flour types, but the King Arthur flour really stood out in this particular case. So we have determined that in the future we are going to be using King Arthur flour for these, but also it's important to note that all three of them rose. They all three worked. So our theory that it was a geography issue just doesn't hold up. Now, the other difference that we had in this recipe that they didn't have in the original was I purchased yeast by the pound. When you buy yeast at the grocery store, you're usually paying at least $1 for one of those little packets, and that is 1/4 of an ounce for that amount of money. And these 1 pound packets of yeast are $9.99, and that's a much cheaper way to do it. It's a lot easier to measure, and I've had much more luck with higher quality results from this type of yeast. So now we're going to go into the making up stage of making the yeast spreads, and this is a standard way of making up any sort of yeast rolls that you can make. So you're going to start out by taking all of your dough out of your bowl that you let it rise in, and then you're going to roll that into a log. And you want to try to keep this log as evenly sized as you can. To cut your rolls as evenly as possible, you're going to grab a bench scraper or a knife, cut your log in half, cut it in half again, and then cut it in half again, which should give you 8 pieces, and then you're going to cut those 8ths into thirds to give you 24 rolls total. This will hopefully get your rolls as evenly sized as you possibly can get them. Then you're going to take your rolls, and to get them as round as possible, you're going to keep the side of your hand on the bench and roll them into as round a shape as possible. By keeping the side of your hand on the board, it's going to tighten up that skin on the top so that you get that pretty top that makes the rolls look very nice. And you're going to repeat that process with all of your rolls. So I repeated the process with the King Arthur flour, and I definitely noticed with this dough that it was a lot softer and easier to work with than with the gold medal flour. The other step that I do with any soft rolls when I let them rise is that I spray them with a little bit of oil, or you can brush them with a tiny bit of oil, just because it keeps the crust from forming before the rise is able to happen. Whenever you are letting things rise, if the crust dries, then it's not going to allow the yeast to be able to fully operate within the dough. And so by keeping the top crust soft for as long as possible, you're able to get a lot more rise out of the product. So the next flour was the white lily flour, and when I tell y'all, never again. This stuff was crumbly, it was hard to work with, I just struggled with it quite a bit in forming the rolls, and it just did not work as well as the others. The finish of the final rolls, you'll notice as well, is a lot drier and more crumbly. It just never really got that pretty smooth finish on top that I was looking for. Just 10 out of 10, do not recommend. But as I mentioned earlier, White Lily literally says that it's better for biscuits and better for things that don't need as much gluten. So this was part of the experiment, and I kind of threw this one in as one that I assumed wasn't going to work. So you're going to cover these with a towel, and don't forget that I sprayed these with some cooking spray as well, but cover them with a towel, and you're going to let them sit until they're about 1/3 larger. These don't have to necessarily double in size, but you do want them to get a little bit larger. And then you're going to bake them. It took about 52 minutes for this process. I should also mention that in the interest of scientific transparency, that our humidity was at about 60% and the temperature was at 75 in our house that day. So that will kind of give you some ideas as well. And after your 52 minutes, or after they're risen a little bit, this is what they're going to look like. As you can see, the White Lily ones have that little rough, uneven surface, but they are larger, and that's what you're looking for. They've kind of grown to where they're all touching each other, and so now we are going to bake them. Our oven is preheated to 400, and I waited until the oven was preheated before I covered them, and they're going to go into the oven for about 20 minutes. I usually check them at 15 minutes, and then you want them to be golden brown. Sometimes you have to rotate them based on the hot spots in your oven. You'll see that one side is darker than the other, and rotate those around. Anytime that I take yeast rolls out of the oven, I always like to brush them with a little bit of melted butter as well. It just helps keep all of the moisture in the rolls. If I were to do this again in the future, which honestly the way these taste, I will definitely be making them again, I think I might brush them with a little bit of an egg wash to start out with, just to help even out the browning a little bit and to help a little bit of a crust form. But this recipe is definitely going to be one that I use again, and I'm really excited that we were hopefully able to solve some of the issues with not being able to duplicate it in this part of the state. The things that you want to think about whenever you're making a yeast spread is trying to not use chlorinated water. If you have chlorinated water at your house, use filtered water. You can also use spring water. Traditional bottled water can also have chlorine in it as well, so that's something you want to think about. And also watch the amount of salt that you put in as well, because salt is going to affect the growth of yeast. But I definitely recommend trying this recipe. It would be awesome for Thanksgiving, and try it out. So as promised, I'm including here all of the pages at the beginning of the cookbook explaining the story behind it. Please feel free to pause to read the story of these incredible ladies and the legacy they're leaving behind. Thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Mixing with Mercs. And if you have a family recipe that you'd like for us to try, please send it to us with any relevant information that you'd like for us to share, and we'd love to try it out for you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow along for more stories.